The first mistake you can make with most artists is to take the instrument out of their hands and give it to somebody else. That's a huge mistake. I have never in my career hired a session musician to come in and play a part that a member of the band was supposed to play. Deciding to abandon that person's performance and hire someone else to do it, you've just fucked the talent.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Vance Powell, Glenn Rosenstein, Michael Wagner, Ray Kennedy, Buddy Miller, John McBride, and Alan Parsons. What do all these rock stars have in common other than that they should be on this podcast? They all have something great to say about Mic Tech microphones. Check out Mic Tech Audio at miktekaudio.com/artists. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Brad Wood, a producer originally from Chicago, now living in Los Angeles, who is known for making some of the coolest indie and rock albums since the late 80s. Brad also owned Idful Music Corporation, a small but mighty recording studio in Wicker Park, where he recorded albums by bands like Seam, Tar, Shrimp Boat, and 11th Dream. Brad, I think I saw Shrimp Boat in Chicago, by the way. I did see them.
Wow.
We may have even double billed with them. I think we played a gig with them at the Elbow Room once upon a time.
No, you didn't. What was the band?
My band was called Enormous Richard. We were out of St. Louis, and we used to go up there and play because Chicago, I would say Chicago, we like to say they really like shtick bands, and we were definitely a shtick band.
Well, awesome. I'm glad you got to see us play.
So I apologize for interrupting my own introduction of you, but I'm still going here. So in 1993, Brad produced what I consider to be one of the greatest records ever. So this is a very meaningful record for me. Exile in Guyville for Liz Phair. This was a record that really struck a chord with me because it was so honest, didn't seem to care what anybody else was doing, and it somehow discarded everything that I thought I was supposed to know about songwriting and musicianship and ended up creating a collection of super cool hit songs. Exile in Guyville opened the door for my understanding of what made a great record. And for Brad, his career as a producer. That's accurate, isn't it? It kind of launched your career as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm still going. Believe it or not, I'm still going here. Brad continues to produce many important artists like Veruca Salt, Sunny Day Real Estate, Thrill Jockey, Placebo, Smashing Pumpkins, Pete Yorn, mewithoutYou, Touché Amoré, and Ben Lee, among others. And I'm stealing a quote here from your own bio, Brad, that you said, "I like to help people make records that are inspiring lyrically and musically. For me, rock music works best when there's intensity, a burning desire to bash out a message. It doesn't have to be loud, although that helps." Thank you, Joe Strummer from The Clash. Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. Brad, you're someone I've been waiting to meet for nearly 3 decades. Are you ready to rock?
I was born ready to rock.
Man, you and Steve Albini, I'm pretty sure that was his answer as well.
No.
Yeah,
really?
You guys are kindred spirits beyond what you would have acknowledged anyway.
Well, that's cool.
So tell us more about how you got started. I know you mentioned something about starting out in Rockford, Illinois. I think you said home of Cheap Trick.
Born and raised in Rockford, Illinois, which is about 90 miles west of Chicago.
Now, I believe that's where a previous guest of mine, Joe Baldrige, said he was also from. Do you know Joe? Did you guys know each other?
Joe.
Well, he said he was from the home of Cheap Trick. So maybe I got it right, maybe I don't. But continue to tell us your story. And I guess Chicago's not such a far distance for you to go from Rockford.
It's not. I was born and raised in Rockford, and in 1964. So besides being old, I was also at the prime age for Cheap Trick's ascendance. They'd been one band or another, one iteration or another until mid-'70s when they became officially Cheap Trick, and they put out a pile of great records over the course of about 2 years. But it really was their live album at Budokan or Budokan, whatever, however you want to pronounce it, that really made them world famous. But as far as anyone my age was considered, Cheap Trick were like gods. They came down from Mount Olympus, and you would see them at the store or just in a car driving down the street. Mm-hmm. Or in my case, my next door neighbor, for some reason, Robin was friends with some of the kids, and some of them were adult kids, and he would ride up in his Kawasaki 900 LTD with his hair flowing and the cool shades. And sometimes we'd talk him into playing soccer with us, and he would hang out. But 1979 was a huge, huge year. I was 15 years old, and that was when Budokan came out, and also Highway to Hell by AC/DC. And I don't know, having grown up in a pretty small town with a pretty big rock band as your sort of guiding light was influential. I mean, they sort of led by example. They stayed local for the most part. And I was, at 15, I was in a rock band playing saxophone and keyboards and singing background vocals. And we all wanted to be like Cheap Trick, although none of us could achieve that because none of us were ever that good. But they were just kind of a presence. They were around when they weren't touring, and they were touring all the time. But, they had some precious off time, and they had rehearsal spaces that sometimes we would also share. They just were kind of around. They were a kind of constant presence, and their success gave hope to a lot of us.
Well, it's a really cool story because I think a lot of successful artists end up moving to what they would consider a music hub usually, which makes a lot of sense career-wise for an artist. But knowing that Cheap Trick stayed right there in Rockville,
Rockford.
Sorry, Rockford. Is that, hearing that story from you, hearing it from Joe Baldrich, they had a clear influence on people by staying in their hometown like that.
They did it. I don't think they all stayed the entire time, except for Rick Nielsen, who is, he's not really the leader of the band. I mean, they kind of all lead the band, and Bunny Carlos as well. They all have had a presence there. I think that Robin moved to Florida sometime in the 70s or 80s, but it seems like he's still around. I don't know. They're just a great working man's band. They're a bar band. They're a bar band that was able to move beyond that. And God, they were just really inspiring. The idea that these guys could, just practice hard enough and play enough shows and build enough of an audience that they could break through was inspiring. They kind of showed that you could do it. Although, again, not many of us did.
Yeah. Well, so how did you transition from being a musician as a teenager to getting into recording?
I'm a saxophone player, and I was really good at it early. I had a really great teacher early on, and eventually got a scholarship to play saxophone at Northern Illinois University in 1982 as a freshman. Really loved jazz, really focused on it, practiced it a lot, transcribed every Charlie Parker solo at half speed.
Wow.
Saw as much jazz as I possibly could, Sonny Rollins and Count Basie and Dexter Gordon and Joe Henderson, not just saxophone players. But that was really my initial inspiration, was jazz.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool because you obviously got a real exposure to written music and learning and understanding how music is composed.
Oh, for sure. But at some point along the line, I got into a rock band as the saxophone player, and we went into studios periodically while I was in high school trying to record our original music, and none of us were really very satisfied with the results. And that's what really kind of started me on the path towards recording. Just a natural curiosity, but I got to be honest, it was more of a dissatisfaction with our experiences in the studio. None of the six of us were happy with what was happening, and maybe I was the least satisfied. But being one of the youngest in the band, I was also the least knowledgeable. So I had sort of just a vague discontent with the way everything sounded and the way the experience went. No knock against the guys that were recording us back then, but there was a sort of dictated way that things were going to occur in the recording studio back in the 70s and early 80s, as I experienced. And I just didn't like it much. So fortunately, the band I was in, the leader of that band was older. He graduated from college. He and his wife bought a house in Rockford, and then we built a recording studio in the basement at his urging. And that was when the light bulb went off.
Nice. So first you started out with the basement studio right there in Rockford. And then I believe you said your first studio in Chicago was Idful Music Corporation, right?
Yes.
Was that sort of your big move, was from Rockford up to Chicago for that?
Well, I moved from Rockford to go to college in DeKalb, Illinois at NIU, and never really lived in Rockford after that, although I did drive back to Rockford for band rehearsals and recording sessions and stuff. But we did a session at my urging with Ian Burgess, rest in peace, Ian. Mm-hmm. And I was encouraged to work with him from an ad in Matter magazine, which was a fanzine, I think out of Evanston, Illinois, that Steve Albini wrote for way, way back. And I think Steve had even put together the ad encouraging readers who were in bands to work with Ian, who had made a lot of the influential punk rock records.
That's right. I think Steve was telling us about him on his interview as well,
Ian's was a British transplant to Chicago, and I can't remember why. Usually British people end up in Chicago because of a woman or a man. and Ian might have been the same way. I don't remember. Anyway, we booked a session with Ian in 1983, I think it was, and we recorded a couple of songs. It still didn't go that particularly well, but I got to know Ian a little bit. So when the time came for me to move to Chicago, I prevailed on Ian to put a good word in for me at Chicago Recording Company and eventually got a job there.
Oh, great. Yeah, I've been to Chicago Recording Company. I spent quite a lot of time in Chicago at Steve's at Electrical, but then also we would kind of flit around between some different local studios, and CRC was one of them.
Yep.
But much later, not till like late 90s.
Yeah, we're talking 1987 is when I moved to Chicago full time and abandoned college without a degree.
That's great.
Well, ask my mom. It's still not great to my mom. And then eventually, it took about 6 months, but I found a job at Chicago Recording Company. And Brian Deck, who was a college buddy of mine, he also had a job at CRC. He'd gotten his prior to mine. He'd worked at other studios in Chicago. And it was while we were working at CRC that we decided we'd open our own facility. And it just kind of grew from there. And within a year of starting at CRC, we had finished constructing and then opened officially in 1989, Idful Music Corporation. Okay,
so it was you and a couple other guys or something like that?
Not just a couple other guys. Brian Deck.
Okay, right.
Yeah, he's a pretty fantastic producer. Iron and Wine and, Counting Crows, that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, right. Awesome.
You might have heard of some of his records.
Absolutely.
And he and I had been really good friends all through college. We were next door neighbors as freshmen, and I had annoyed him with loud music enough times that he came over and pounded on my door one night. We became friends after that. We were roommates in college. We've just been pals for a long time, but we both spent a lot of time listening to the music that we liked, and we would oftentimes complain about the recording quality or the production choices of the bands. And eventually we just kind of figured, we could probably do this ourselves. And so we did.
Well, so when you guys built your studio, did you have to do a lot of construction? Did you really have to build it from the ground up? Was it like a huge investment for you to start a studio at that time? Did you have to, find $100,000, $200,000 for tape machines and stuff like that? Or was it a little more punk rock than that?
It was a lot more punk rock than that. We had a third partner named Dan Sonis, and Dan was in a band with Brian. He was a bass player, and he had a bit of a family inheritance, but just a bit. And he was initially looking to put an analog recording studio in the basement of the house he lived in. And that grew into a full-fledged facility. And I think he had $38,000 committed all in, and that included, maybe a year's worth of rent if we could find it, all the construction, all the materials.
And you guys were constructing DIY. You were breaking out hammers yourself.
Yeah, the three of us had almost no experience with construction. I had limited experience with it, just picking it up through the years at home with my father or building this recording studio in Rockford a few years before. But we built really based off of a build-it-yourself construction book we bought at Handy Andy, which is a precursor to Home Depot. We bought the lumber from Handy Andy. We bought the hammers and the nails and the screw gun, everything. And we read lots and lots of books. There was no internet back then, so it was a trip to the library or traveling to a friend's house or pulling favors from people to sort of get a hint at things. And we literally taught ourselves how to do construction, and we built a really big recording studio, relatively speaking.
Do you recall the feeling of reading in a book, a description of the STC, the sound transmission class of a cinder block, and you're like, oh, cool, yeah, great, all right, well, we should, and then you think about it, and you're like, well, what does that mean? I actually don't know what that sounds like.
I got to be honest, we didn't do any of that stuff. Like we weren't looking at those things at all. It was strictly just basic construction: drywall, 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x12s, conduit, construction glue, and Owens Pink, insulation.
Yeah.
I did take some acoustical physics in college. It took 3 years of that, and my acoustical physics professor, Dr. Rossing, was kind enough to help us work with some sort of PC-based program to figure out what the actual modes of vibration were going to be in our live room. And we also prevailed on an acoustician about our live room. I think we had a modified live end, dead end room, which I would never build again, but at the time seemed to make a lot of sense.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah, when I went to school in 91, 92, it was the lead, live end, dead end, live end, dead end.
LED, LEDE, yep. And but we didn't really mess around with the different types of materials. We kind of figured we'd be putting absorbers on the wall, which we did. And we wanted it to be adjustable, which it was. But the live room was really big and had a concrete floor and mostly just drywall walls and ceilings and no parallel surfaces. It was extremely live. And I personally struggled for years to overcome it. And we were so perpetually broke that we couldn't afford curtains or any kind of mass amount of absorption to knock down the sound. But part of my production technique came out of necessity, learning how to close mic, choosing mics that had good off-axis rejection, learning how to compress a room mic or not, the distance of a room mic from your drum kit or your sound source in general. It was really it was trial by fire. I was being thrown into the deep end, mixing all my metaphors. But we really, Brian and I didn't really know a lot about recording. We learned a little bit in college. We learned a little bit being in bands. We learned a little bit more working at recording studios, maybe Brian more than me. But speaking for myself, my experience at CRC didn't really allow me a lot of opportunities to learn much. I wasn't there long enough, and they had a pretty hierarchical system where you rose up the ranks, and I'd only recently become maybe a first assistant just a few months before I left. So a lot of what I learned was going in at CRC off hours, sitting at the SSL and staring at that giant manual and putting up a multi-track reel, which they didn't discourage you from doing. They were really cool about letting their employees in during off times. And I did an awful lot of putting up multi-track reels and just playing it back and figuring out what each channel did and patching into the occasional outboard and trying to, just try to get my head around signal flow. Like, where is this coming from? Where is it going? How does a patch bay work? A lot of that was just done by myself.
That's cool. Yeah. Well, I think that's the way to learn, is just digging in. And I think it's great when a studio lets you go in and spend a little extra time too.
Yeah, they were good about that.
Brad, I like to ask our guests to kind of launch us off with an inspirational quote. Have you got anything that you'd like to share with us as we kick off the podcast?
I do. I have the same quote I've been using since we opened the studio, Idful, in 1989. But it's foul, so I'm going to swear.
I love it. This is rated explicit just to allow for that sort of thing.
All right. We had it on a T-shirt, actually. We printed up. It's don't feed the suits, don't fuck the talent.
I like it, man. Like, those are two things that will bring down the possibility of it being a great record pretty quickly.
Well, yes. I mean, it's figurative and literal. Don't feed the suits was back in the era of major label A&R people who, would show up and want to do things and insinuate themselves into a recording session or into a recording project. And that's okay. They can show up, but they always pay. Don't ever give them anything.
Right.
And then don't fuck the talent is also figurative and literal. Just don't.
Yeah.
Your client, your artist is like, their needs are top priority.
So I guess, figurative is like, don't screw over your client and the record needs that they have, but literally also like maybe don't sleep with the singer of the band or something.
Exactly. And you know what? I've been doing this for 30 years this year. And I have to be honest, I have met more of our peers, other record producer, engineers, recordists, who have done exactly that, who have had physical and maybe romantic relationships with their clients. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I have a hunch it has to do with the sort of explosive and emotional nature of recording, and how that can oftentimes, for me at least, speaking only for myself, can win in the presence of the opposite sex, or the gender that I'm attracted to, can oftentimes be almost the same sort of emotional reaction as a physical attraction. And that kind of, how do you pronounce the word? Frisson? Frisson?
I don't know.
Frisson. That kind of response is best left, I think, to be recorded and during the process of making an album. And I have enough of a history with working with female singer-songwriters, starting most notably with Liz, that it's served me really well to keep that in mind, to try to channel any feelings. Although now that I'm 53 and I'm, gray-haired and balding and old, that doesn't happen. That's not going to happen so much anymore. But there was a time when I was younger where, sparks could potentially fly. And I think that a lot of that is, maybe just on my side, but restraint, and also just a constant realignment, and remembering that the focus needs to be on your client, the artist that you're working with. It's really not about you. That's the figurative, don't fuck with the talent.
Right, indeed.
And a lot of times I think that it can end up being really great for your career to recede into the background, and let this artist's vision come forth as easily and as quickly as possible.
Well, so now, Brad, share with us a story about a time where you did kind of fail. I mean, maybe not in that specific way, but I like to hear a failure story where you didn't do things just right and maybe became a great learning experience for you.
Well, there's plenty, and I've had to think about it a little bit. The one that probably is the one that lasts with me, sticks with me the longest, is my recording experience with the Smashing Pumpkins.
Oh, wow.
That was really one of the more confusing work experiences I've ever had, maybe the.
Wow.
And that was initially meant to be a Billy Corgan solo album, and we had started talking in early 1997 about recording, and it seemed to be great, and we had a mutual friend who was advocating for it. It seemed like, it might be a smart thing to do. I'd known Billy since 1990, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And you're still in Chicago at that time?
Yeah, yep. And that experience was, in the end, really dissatisfying, not only for me, but especially because Billy was so dissatisfied with it in the end. And I really, really don't like to have dissatisfied clients. It just irks me. It's a failure on my part, at least to some degree. But ultimately, here are the analogies again, or the metaphors. You're the captain of the ship, and you're being asked to captain this ship to shore, dock it, and successfully get all the payload off, passengers all alive. And I didn't do that with the Adore album. I worked on it for about 4 months, and then I got let go, although I was in no mood to continue anyway. But we had taken a break, and they were going to reconvene in Los Angeles, and I really didn't want to go, and it turns out they didn't really want me to go either. So I effectively was fired from that record. And I could see the progression from a really fertile couple of initial weeks where we got a lot done, and then watching it just slip from my grasp, my lack of ability to keep things moving and to serve my client, Yeah. There are other reasons too. I mean, I don't think that Billy is known as like the easiest person in the world to work with. He's got, especially since then, he's got a history of, switching band members and changing management and record labels and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. I equate that in the music business to dating. There's like people make records together like dating in a lot of ways at times. Not everybody, but some people do.
But that was a watershed experience for me because it taught me a lot about what I had yet to learn, which was priorities. And I've learned I took away a lot of stuff from that. I mean, I had to sift through the ashes on my own part, and find what was useful from that and try to take something away from a bad experience. And part of it was I had just become a father 6 weeks before we started that record.
Oh man.
And the pace of recording was brutal by any stretch of the imagination. It was 7 days a week, maybe a day off every now and again. And I was putting in never less than 12 hours a day, in at 8 in the morning, 9 in the morning, out at 1 a.m. every single night, every single day, and I can't really recall a day that was under 12 hours. And not that Billy was there the whole time, but I was also engineering, and we had a Pro Tools engineer. We had a lot of work to do before and after the actual recording session had started and ended. And I missed an awful lot of my first kid's first couple months. And that started a journey for me of learning how to try to balance work and family in this crazy business. And I feel like that process was hastened by me working with the Pumpkins. I might not have ever dealt with it had I not gone into the fire pits of a Pumpkin session.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that kind of story. I myself went through that. And I know you've also been a guest on my friend Matt Boudreau's podcast, Working Class Audio, and I'm going to guess that you guys talked plenty about that. Yeah, that's work-life balance is a priority for him, as it really kind of should be for anyone that's in our situation. Yeah. Well, something I noticed about that record, about Adore, that's how it's pronounced, Adore, right?
Yeah.
Okay. When I was listening to Adore, I really recognized this era of loops. You remember the loop era that we kind of all went through. And 97 is a time of garbage. It's a time of a lot of, all of a sudden we've all got CDs with all these loops on them. They start appearing in all kinds of records. Also, the drum machines are coming back too. Can you talk a little bit about the process of going from lots of live drums through the loop era and what I think is sort of bringing back live drums? Do you feel like you were able to bring back drumming? And do you have any comments on that?
I do have some pretty strong feelings about that. I think that I was as guilty as anyone else in that era of dabbling in loops. It was really fun to see samplers go from being not really controllable much by MIDI to being completely controllable. And for instance, when we were working on the Pumpkins record, I think we were using one of their Kurzweil samplers. I had a pair of Akai, had an S3000 and an S2800, I think it was. And I would use it with Studio Vision Pro. And a lot of times I would do full drum recordings and then do a stereo mix and loop that and then play that back on the keyboard and chop it up with Recycle and replay it. It was a ball. It was just so much fun. But like a lot of other record producers, I would do this thing where you would start a song with an acoustic guitar and a loop, and then it would go to full drums for the pre-chorus or chorus, and then back to a loop for the verse. And then, maybe second half of the verse, the drummer finally gets unleashed and he or she gets to play the drums again. And then maybe a breakdown chorus where it goes down to a filtered drum loop. It sounds all really dated to me. And specifically for the Pumpkins, some of the songs were supposed to be sounding like a loop, and maybe were recorded with an old ribbon mic, a single mic on a drum kit, but they usually weren't. They usually just played live, unless they changed it afterwards. But the songs that I'm thinking of, there was very little looping for the stuff that sounded like real drums. Mm-hmm. But gosh, I don't know. I was a hip hop fan for a long time. I'm not so much anymore. And sonically, it's getting more interesting. Lyrically, it's a lot more interesting. But there's a whole 10, 15 years where it wasn't speaking to me at all. And I just completely lost interest and maybe have missed out on some things.
Well, you just got to go back and watch all the Netflix specials now. There's so many documentaries on hip hop that are great now.
That's true. I could do that. I'll do that with all the free time I've got. But I also got tired of hearing loops. I got tired of hearing sort of repeating non-ending loops that would just drop out for a couple of seconds. I got tired of people manipulating them. I got tired of filtering them. It's just, to my ears, a very sort of played out technique. Yeah. And I almost never use a loop now. I mean, I can't think of a record I've worked on in years where I obviously did a loop. I've worked on records where demos came in with loops, and then we hired drummers, or we had the band, drummer play. And it does seem like maybe the last 10 years or so, a push back towards making things sound more live, whether or not that's actually happening, because the drum programming has gotten so amazing that I'm oftentimes fooled. I'm like, wow, where did you guys record these drums? And they're like, no, man, that's Logic.
Exactly.
So I don't know. I think it was just an aesthetic choice that just got overused, and I still hear it sometimes in top 40 music, pop music, but I mostly hear the sound of real drum machines. And there's nobody's trying to trick anybody into thinking that this is like a real drum kit now. When I like the sound of electronic drums if they're allowed to sound like what they are.
Right.
So that's my answer to that.
Well, that's cool. I like that answer. And I think that, we're all faced with stuff that comes along that's new and different, and we want to try it out. And I was asking Kyle Lenning this when I interviewed him earlier, this idea of, are we able to know when something comes along that might sound dated later? And I don't know that we ever really can. I think you just kind of enjoy trying stuff. Some things we'll look back on and they might really define an era, and some things we'll look back on, they might seem timeless.
I think some stuff has come across my radar, and I've decided not to put it on records I've worked on. Some stuff I fell for it, and in the era of digital recording, it's a lot easier to incorporate these things. You don't have to buy a lot of hardware. You just have to have the plugins.
Yeah.
So the ability to experiment and stretch sort of what it is that is allowable has really expanded. I'm pretty wary, though, and I hear, so many sound tools. The crystallizer effect I hear on everything. I'm hearing a little bit less now, but I mean, I was hearing it even on like recent Radiohead records. Like, God, guys, I mean, that you hear the crystallizer effect. Like, that was really cool in the 80s when Eventide, chucked it into
the H3000. That was always the patch that I'd hear, and I would go like, whoa, and then I go, where the hell am I going to use this on a record next?
Right? And then it went away for a long time, and then Sound Toys came out with Echo Boy, and it's been reinstated, and now it's in pedals. I worked with a band recently where there was a real nice boutique pedal that the guitar player would engage, and it's basically a crystallizer effect. It's in them. Like, God damn it, there it is again. It's something that used to be really difficult to do. Now is fairly easy. I don't know if there's just a crystallizer parts bin at the local electronics store now. But that kind of stuff, I may try to use that, but I would maybe filter out all the high end out of it, or take those crystallized, take that thing and put it through something else to mask it. But in general, my philosophy of recording has returned to what it started out back in the 80s, which is to just try to record a room mic with every natural sound source. Just try to record the sound of the room you're in, whatever room you happen to have booked or lucked into or wandered into, if you're in a tobacco barn in Kentucky, or if you're in my garage studio in Valley Village. The sonic thumbprint of the album you're making is, in my mind, a very important part of what might make that a classic record down the line.
Yeah, it's more likely to make it stand out too, right?
Yeah, sure. And so maybe it's not the best sounding room in the world, but let's find a place to put a microphone as a room mic that might capture something about that acoustic guitar that you're also close miking, or certainly that electric guitar, or even a vocal, and certainly your drums, anything that's loud enough to excite enough electrons to, to warrant having a room mic. Probably you these days, you probably, have the track space to record separately a room mic. And so I'm finding that I rely more on room mics now than I ever have. And maybe it's a conscious or subconscious attempt to return it back to something that even a casual listener brain will acknowledge as something real. All
right. Well, let me ask you right away a question about room mics. For somebody who wants to do more of that, what are some of the things to look out for? What are some of the danger zones that you might want to be aware of when you start throwing room mics up and moving them around?
Depends on the sound source. Can you narrow that down?
Let's talk about drums.
Well, drums are loud. So if you're in a small room for your drums, you're in luck, because your room mics they'll be really active and really engaged right away. So if you're in a small room for drums, My suggestion would be to put them as far away as you can, and if they're cardioid mics, point them at the drum kit from wherever they are. Start with that, pointing at the kit, but you may want to turn them so they're facing the opposite wall, sort of, staring straight ahead as opposed to angled inward towards the center where maybe the kit is. That way you might get a little more of a stereo spread. I tend to not use cardioid mics for room mics. I tend to either use PZMs, pressure zone microphones, which are cheap and plentiful, I think, still.
And if you step on them, it's usually not a big deal.
You might not break it, yeah. Or I'll use any kind of microphone that's got a switchable pattern, and you put it into Omni. They don't have to be really expensive mics. They can be the least expensive mics in your inventory.
Do you find, for example, that cymbals can be a challenge in room mics?
Depends on the drummer, but yes, in general, you got to watch out for it. And if you got a drummer that hits the cymbals as hard as the other drums, then it might be a problem. Then it's a matter of lowering the microphones. Think about where the sound source is coming from. And if you got a PZM, you can put that on the ground and actually lay it on the floor. Yeah. You'll get a lot less cymbal then.
Yeah.
Well, it's experimenting,
All right. How about, do you ever use a room mic on bass?
All the time.
Talk about some cool ways to do that.
Take a PZM, set it back as far as you can.
All right.
and record it.
And for example, you might have a closed mic on the bass cabinet and a room mic, and you're balancing between the two?
Absolutely. Yeah. I just print them separately. And I did that even when I was, working analog back in the 80s and 90s. You want to check your phase with any of these things. But especially with bass guitar. So I close mic, stick a mic, near the speaker and get something you like. And then put your room mic, which could be, again, a cardioid or a Omni mic or a PZM. Maybe if you got a 20-foot deep room, put it against the wall, as far away as you can get. If you're in a huge room, maybe stick it 20 feet away, but maybe not so far away that it's ridiculously roomy. And then bring that mic up and combine it with, listen to it at the same time as your close mic and flip the phase on one or the other and see if there's a noticeable difference. And if there is, go out there and move that room mic around a little bit until, if you're lucky enough to have somebody who's willing to go out there and stand in front of the bass amp, move it around until it sounds better. You're basically looking to avoid frequencies canceling each other out, combining in ways that you lose low end or you end up something that sounds hollow. It's pretty simple. It's pretty simple. There's math to it, but there's no repeatable math because it really depends on the song. It depends on the bass amp, depends on the size of the room, depends on the microphones, the tone of the bass. All those things will factor in where you've placed the room mic for one song might not work for the next if the bass player is suddenly turning on a distortion pedal for the whole song.
Yeah, interesting. That's a good point to bring up too.
Phase. Always check your phase.
Phase. All right. Well, I really want to talk to you about working with Liz Phair and Exile and Guyville and some other things too, Veruca Salt as well. So let me jump to that. Can you, Brad, tell us the story of doing Exile and Guyville with Liz Phair? I know it may be a long story, but answer it how you want.
Man, that is a long story. Liz and I were introduced by a mutual friend in 1991, and the idea was that she was going to make a solo album, and I was to engineer it. And I got to hear her girly sound songs, which were just, at the time, 4-track cassettes. They weren't called something in particular, but she'd recorded a bunch of the songs that were on Exile and Guyville. And I was super inspired by that. I was blown away by her lyrics.
Yeah,
and
me too.
Oh, my God. Just unbelievable. And I just was stunned walking home that night, trying to, my mind was racing of trying to figure out what's the best way forward with this. We started recording sessions in late fall of 1991. We only did a couple of those sessions with somebody else on, I can't even, I think I might have been the drummer. We had someone else on bass. I don't even know if I got around to playing drums. I think I did. Anyway, we did a handful of sessions. That all fell apart. That relationship with the mutual friend ended. And it wasn't until January of 1992 that Liz and I reconvened. We went to go see a movie and we talked about stuff. And then a few days later, she came in and we tracked the song Fucking Run. just
So
the
good.
two. Yeah, just the two of us, and we did it all in one evening.
So now you play drums on the recordings or on the record as well?
Yeah, on Guyville, I play all the drums, all the bass.
That's great.
Some of the keyboards, not her piano, but I played like the organ and synths and percussion, and some guitar too.
Well, I don't know if it's premature to ask this now, but I'll definitely want to know or hear you talk about the process of how you capture the beginning of a song and what happens next on that record.
Well, Liz had most of the songs already written, and the way we approached it, once it was just her and I working on things, I wanted her to play her guitar the way that she liked it. So she has this old Duosonic, and she played through a PV Backstage, I think it was.
Nice.
And
was that a solid state?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just a tiny little solid state amp. And it had a really nice sounding reverb in it. And I just liked the way it sounded. And she was comfortable with it. So I think I put her through a tuner and then a stereo chorus pedal. And I would take the output of that and put that through another amp. And so I usually ran her guitar in stereo almost every song. She would play either to a click or to shakers or some sort of percussion that I would play to a click. So usually there's a click track in her head, in her headphones, some shakers or tambourine or maracas, and then she would play the song and then sing a couple passes of vocals, and then we would add music. Later on, I would talk her into letting me do drums. The song Fucking Run, she had played all the guitars, which I think it was just two, I think just doubling herself. And she had resisted letting me play drums, and eventually she said, okay, fine, go play drums. And I ran into the lounge. I didn't even have time to set the drum kit up in the big room, and it was just her and I. So I just set a kick and snare and hi-hat. I don't even think there was a crash cymbal. I put a PZM. I stuck it above the drum kit in a ceiling tile so that it would stay up there. Mm-hmm. And that was the sound of that drum kit. We recorded with one mic.
Wow.
And it sounded really great. And she liked it so much, I said, let me do it one more time, because I think I made a couple mistakes. And she said, fine, but I thought that was perfect. So she was in the control room hitting the record button. And then we did another pass of me playing drums on an adjacent track. And I came in and I just basically left them both up, not knowing, which one was better, and panned it left and right. And that's how it ended up. It was me playing drums twice.
That's great.
Yeah, and I was hearing the other drum kit in my head while I was playing the second time. So I was mimicking and reacting to my own performance from a couple minutes before, because I just didn't have time to set the headphone cues up more accurately. I was taking the advantage of Liz saying yes to letting me play drums finally.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Thank goodness, because one of the things that's so brilliant about Exile and Guyville is that nothing is overthought, or at least it doesn't sound overthought to me. You guys let the moment happen everywhere.
Thanks for saying that. But, really, it was a matter of practicality. Every single song was recorded with her voice and guitar first, and not always to a click. Most of the time to a click, sometimes not. But everything had to hang off of her voice and her guitar. If it couldn't meld with it, it would be abandoned. So there aren't a lot of hidden tracks, unused guitar tracks or synthesizers or any other varied instrumentation on those multi-tracks, because we would abandon stuff as soon as we were unsatisfied with it. We didn't have to wait to see how it was going to work with the lead vocal until later, which is something that's particularly challenging for a singer-songwriter in the recording studio. The idea that you have someone who's played piano or guitar and is singing, and then has to wait to see how all of this stuff reacts that you've added, until you finally put the vocals on. In this instance, we decided we are going to make sure that all 18 songs on this record were going to work as a vocal and a guitar first and foremost. Like if you just muted everything else, this would still hold up.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of editorial eye right from the start served us really, really well. And it's taken me a long time after the fact to try to put those kinds of ideas into effect in my own, band productions. It's easier said than done.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun too. I mean, I get a chance to do that kind of with my own band when we get together and there's no pressure around what we're doing. We just kind of let the creative process be what it is and not overthink it. But I love having a vocal right at the beginning of a production, and then everything you add has to fit. It can't destroy what was already great, as opposed to waiting till later as if something's going to be great down the road somewhere.
That's true, but oftentimes lyrics aren't done until the last minute. Vocal melodies aren't defined until after everything else has been recorded. I mean, more often than not, that scenario doesn't present itself.
Yeah.
As try as you might, it's harder to do than you might think.
So now, did you guys go back to re-record the vocals one more time afterwards, or you got them done and finished early on?
As I recall, most of them were done early on. I think there were times when she would come in and try it again, and we used a variety of different mics on her. She had I don't know if she still does, but she had a sibilance issue that I struggled with.
Okay.
Over the course of the recording. The album took a really long time to make. We just recorded when I had free time and when she had free time for months and months and months, where she might only come in 2 or 3 evenings a week or 2 or 3 evenings a month, maybe 8 o'clock until midnight. Never charged her for it. Sometimes I'd have to drive to her parents' place in Winnetka, pick her up, drive her to Chicago, record for a couple hours, drive her back to Winnetka and drop her back off at her parents'. But it wasn't until late summer or spring, I can't recall, when Matador Records signed her. And when that happened, then we had a bit of a budget and we had, a purpose. I cleared the decks. We booked time. And at this point, Casey Rice had been working on the record too. He was an employee at Idful, our first non-owner employee. And he brought tons to the table. And we made pretty quick work of the rest of the record after that.
That's great. Well, so now when you began a process like that, did you have the forward thinking to make an arrangement that you felt like if something happens with this record, I will be included as opposed to being excluded? Or did you just go for it and just make the music, and then when the label interest came along, you sorted it out when you got there? You can answer that if you want to. If you don't, that's fine too. I think you're laughing because that's such a classic question, especially of our era.
I had made a lot of records prior to meeting Liz. I'd worked with mostly just rock bands, and some of those bands, not all of them, had moved on to indie labels or major labels, less major labels, but mostly bigger indies. And almost every time that occurred, I was left behind for a bigger name or somebody who had a track record. And that was continuing. It was really frustrating to not be able to get over that hurdle of, or that catch-22, where you can't get the bigger projects until you've had a discography, but you can't get the discography. So what Brian and I did when we started Idful was we just decided, as long as people credited us with recording it, recorded at Idful Music, get the name of the company right, preferably use the logo. We'll provide you with the logo, and put our names down there. We just cranked it out, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of songs, dozens of albums in the first year alone, and just kind of figured word of mouth was really the best way to do it. And having said that, by 1991, I was getting pretty stumped at how I was ever going to make a living doing this. I was a janitor at the Chicago Theater midnight to 8 a.m. in order to make ends meet. I never took a paycheck from Idful Music the entire time it existed.
Wow.
Yeah, it was, it says more about my business acumen maybe, but it was really, really frustrating. And when I met Liz, I was really determined. I'd never been struck by an unknown songwriter's music as hard as I was by hers. I mean, it was really significant. It was really noticeable.
Me too.
I just was stunned by it. And I think pretty much everybody who likes that kind of music, who had heard her demos, which again, it was just her 4-track recordings that she had done, I think mostly in San Francisco. Everybody had the same effect. I think it kind of stunned everybody. And yet I was the one that was being asked to record it. So I just really didn't want to screw the pooch. I really didn't want to lose the handle on it. And I was willing to do pretty much anything to make sure that was going to come to fruition.
What was it? It was don't feed the suits, don't fuck the talent, and don't screw the pooch. That was the third one?
Yeah.
All right.
I think Gus Grissom said that. Don't screw the pooch. He's one of the original astronauts. I think I saw it on The Right Stuff, a great movie. So to make a long story short, we got to the point where we had an album's worth of material and no plans to release it. And that's when this same kind person, John Henderson, who'd introduced her to me a year before, had said, I think Gerard Causselay has a new label called Matador. He might be interested. And I called him on the phone. And the next day we FedExed a cassette, I think a 6-song cassette. And then they faxed us a 2-page contract, I think the following day.
That's great.
And so I knew the record was going to come out on Matador. But once the album was finished, mastered, sequenced and mastered, Liz did spend a little time with another friend visiting major labels with this 18-song opus. And there was a lot of pressure on her to abandon the Matador deal and maybe re-record the album or remix it, certainly remaster it, maybe record some more songs.
Right.
And to her credit, she saw through all that. Not that those were bad ideas, but she saw it through to the end. She entertained some other offers and decided to stay with Matador with the recordings that we had done. And I have to say, and I've said it before, I feel like I owe my entire production career to her faith in me and what we did.
That's great. What a great story. And, you know, maybe she just kept reading Don't Feed the Suits over and over again on the wall of the studio.
Maybe. Well, I don't know.
So that's great. And I appreciate you sharing that because I think people still today are concerned with that. I've had questions from rock stars who, that's how I refer to the listeners of the show here, you know, asking about, well, can I release this song? What if somebody helps me do this? You know, there's still, people always have this fear sometimes that stuff is going to be taken from them. So it's great to hear, you know, just the story of how that went. But I would like to ask you a little bit more about Exile and Guyville, particularly the songs and Liz's unique approach to songwriting and singing and melody. I mean, like, fucking Run, the chorus doesn't even happen until you're like, you know, most A&R people would have turned it off already. It happens way near the end of the whole thing. And that just permeates throughout the whole record. These songs are written in a way that where you're constantly going on a different turn and the chord progressions aren't what you would expect and the melody just follows along. How would you like to talk about that? Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I'll confirm that yes, she does have an unusual song form, at least especially then. I don't know if she's a more conventional writer now. I tend to think that she is. Either that or we've all just kind of gotten used to how she writes songs. But at the time especially, I was struck with her vocal melody choices. She jumps all over the place.
Yeah.
She doesn't stick to a 3 or 5 note range with the occasional octave up. She will leap major sevenths, major ninths, and falsetto down to a low guttural, like 5 notes below her range. And she does it effortlessly. And if I remember correctly, a lot of the times she was writing these melodies and then coming up with the chords afterwards to match.
That's great.
So however her method is at writing these things, it has more to do with like the Joni Mitchell style of stream of consciousness kind of writing, at least that's what I call it, than with song form, song craft. You know, you've got an intro, you've got a verse, you've got a chorus. She, to me, I mean, I'm just going to say it, lyrically and as a songwriter, for 3 albums, those first 3 albums, she is as important to me as Bob Dylan is to me.
Yeah.
And no joke. I mean, I return to those albums and to those songs over and over again as my life, you know, goes on and as I encounter different aspects of adulthood. I return to songs that were written by a person who was in her 20s, early 20s, who had experienced none of these things yet. And I find solace and enlightenment, and I hear new things. I discover new things lyrically in Liz's music that only people like Dylan and maybe Nick Cave have provided me.
That's cool.
You know, Leonard Cohen as well. She is, to me, at that level, I'd say she's, you know, I'm Lenny Kaye to her Patti Smith, you know, if I can. I mean, I have not worked with a lyricist who got that close to that kind of greatness. That's my opinion.
Well, let me ask you this. First question is, did she arrive when you guys were working together with a real confidence and a finality to the arrangement, so that she's just said, hey, Brad, this is the way it goes? Or was it one of these places where another producer would have come along and shut down all these peculiarities of the song and tried to make it more normal, and we would have lost such a great production and record?
I don't think that she had a whole lot of ideas about what the sounds are supposed to be. After she got signed to Matador, a couple of days after or a week after, she said, I want to make it a double album and a song-for-song response to Exile on Main Street by the Stones.
That's great.
And it was after that we tried to refer to that album for some of the sonic inspirations. And that helped a lot to have a bit of a sonic roadmap, especially for Casey and I. But I don't remember Liz saying, this is where I want you to take these yarn-covered mallets and and play the countertop in the kitchen and put that through a delay line and pitch it to a note that then you put through the SBX 90 and pitch it down an octave, and then through another delay line and then a reverb and put that in, record that to tape. That was all just me. And I have to say that Liz allowed me to do stuff that I hadn't done since I was in college. I was dragging out equipment that I'd acquired over the years because there were no other ideas. I mean, she would play her guitar, she would sing the song, and then it's like, okay, now what do you think you want to have here? Sometimes we'd have an idea, well, we would definitely want to have like a Charlie Watts kind of drum beat, or it would be, no, let's have something that sounds more spacey. And she'd go out and play it on piano, and I would feed it through a delay line and be filtering the delay line, feeding it different frequencies in real time, recording that while she's playing to the song. And then she would alter what she was doing based on the playback in her, in her headphones. That was really common. I don't think she had a really strong idea about what things were supposed to sound like, and it was more or less left up to myself and to Casey eventually.
Well, I applaud you not dissecting her songs and straightening them out,
Oh my God, no way. Are you kidding? You know what? I hate to say it, but there's plenty of evidence of that later on in her career with producers who did just that. And the first mistake
you brought it up, not me. You brought it up, not me.
I've said it before. And I've gotten in trouble for it. I don't really give a shit anymore. The first mistake you can make with most artists is to take the instrument out of their hands and give it to somebody else. That's a huge mistake. I have never in my career hired a session musician to come in and play a part that a member of the band was supposed to play. I have never done that, not a single time. There are records I've been hired to make because of my reputation for not ever having done that. Mm-hmm. And I'm really proud of that. And it makes me wonder what the hell other producers are thinking of. Like I have hired plenty of session musicians, but that's for a singer-songwriter project where there is nobody in the room that plays guitar. So let's bring in a friend of mine that plays guitar. That's no problem. I'm an okay drummer, but maybe you need a much better drummer. Man, I've got a list of great drummers that'll come in and play. But I have never worked with an artist or a band that came into the studio, and because they had trouble maybe performing the song they wrote on guitar to the level that we all want to achieve, and then deciding to abandon that person's performance and hire someone else to do it, you've just fucked the talent.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I've never, ever done that. I will sit with you for days and weeks, retuning your guitar and punching in chord by chord, if that's what it takes to keep the DNA of that song intact.
That's cool. That's great insight and great advice, I think, for people. Mm. And, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and you're in Los Angeles now, and both those places are notorious for, bringing in session musicians. Maybe not always for replacing what somebody might play, but I think that's great advice.
Thanks. I live by it. I live or die. My career lives or dies by it. And I made a record for the Bangles, and part of the reason they hired me when they reformed with all the original members in 2001 was because in interviews with them, I reiterated this. They've had a history in the 80s with their big albums of struggling with having session players come in and replace or just replay or just play outright guitar parts and sometimes maybe drums, even parts that they could play themselves in, because it wasn't professional enough, or it was taking too long, or any reason at all that has to do with the convenience of the staff and less the actual feelings of the artist.
Yeah.
And I was really happy to have gotten that gig and to have spent as many months as I did with those wonderful women making a record that they could claim all their own. All of their creative decisions were their own. And it's ironic too, because I'm friends with some of the people that have produced other of their records, and those are really nice people, really great and really talented people too. It's just, I think maybe the times they were in the early to mid 80s in LA with so many session players around, and the prevalence of record labels, A&R people, it was just how things got done, I guess, here back then.
Coming down from the suits again. It's the suits, right?
Yeah, don't feed the suits. Yeah.
Don't feed the suits. Well, let's talk about another record you made with some fantastic women, Veruca Salt. Can you tell us a little bit about discovering those guys and making their breakout records?
Yeah, they were a band that started, I think, in earnest, maybe 93 or 94. And I forget the actual year. But Nina and Louise had put together a band with Nina's brother, Jim, on drums and Steve on bass. And they were rehearsing in the same rehearsal space that a band I had been producing was in. And I think their first gig, or one of their first gigs, was opening for this band. They were called Number One Cup, and Veruca Salt were opening. And I would see them. I'd go to Number One Cup rehearsals. It was in this loft building, and the rehearsal space was in a vault, a bank vault, which is weird. So they had this giant door that they would sort of close, and it was brick and square and odd. And I heard a little bit of the band playing once when I showed up early. Veruca had shared this rehearsal space, and they were running late. So long story short is I was just completely compelled by what I was hearing, and I went to go see them play a couple nights later and loved them. A friend of ours who had a 7-inch label was looking for talent, and I suggested he go see the band, and he liked them and signed them. And so we tracked, I think I'm trying to get the timeline right. We tracked Seether and maybe one or two other songs, and eventually got around to making an album. And we were making the album while Seether was exploding on the radio.
That's great.
Yeah. Everything sort of happened so fast with them. In hindsight, it would have been nice to let the band season a little bit and get to know how to play together a little more before putting them in the studio. It was so fast.
That was that time in the mid 90s.
Yeah, it was all happening real quickly. They could speak more to the effects of that, because I think it had a larger effect, sort of, obviously on their lives and on their careers. But that was a blur. I don't remember a whole lot about the specifics. We had a lot to do in a short period of time. I know that they're really funny, really smart. Nothing's done by accident. Beautiful harmonies. Nina and Louise's ability to harmonize, and with Jim's help with arrangement, he's an excellent guitar player and an encyclopedia about rock music. Between the four of us, Nina, Louise, Jim, and I, we came up with some really great passing tones on harmonies, especially in the bridge on Seether. Really, really sophisticated vocal stuff that to this day thrills me.
Yeah.
And then they reformed the original lineup a couple years ago, and they called me up, and I engineered and produced their last record, Ghost Notes, which I love, and that might be my favorite project as far as engineering of any I've worked on.
That's awesome. Rockstar's, a lot of Brad's great work is on YouTube, so I'll include links in the show notes. We'll also include links over to Brad's website, so you can go check out all this stuff here. There's a ton of great stuff, and I saw that you were working with them again, so that's really exciting.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one more question, then we'll take a break and hit the jam session to finish up. Let's talk about rock for a second. One of the things that I noticed right away, especially when Veruca Salt came out, Brad, just so you know, I was a kid, 23, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, when Exile and Guyville appeared, when Veruca Salt came out. And these records really were meaningful to me, and to see your name on both of them too. I was like, oh, that's cool as shit, So, but one of the things is, the guitars just rocked. I mean, these were examples of how you make an indie rock band sound killer. So can you talk a little bit about recording the guitars on that, and also touch on this topic of making something loud enough, because loud enough back then might be a totally different meaning than loud enough today. And what does that mean to you?
Well, to the first part of your question, guitars, I'm a jazz guy, or I was a jazz guy, and I didn't listen to any rock at all. Maybe just what was on the radio. I bought some 45s, but I was a snob initially and thought that rock was a lesser art form. And it really was The Who that turned me around. I had a next door neighbor that gave me a copy of Who's Next.
Nice.
For a birthday. It had been out for a while, but man, that knocked me on my ass. And I played it over and over again. And I remember saying to my mom one night, she came home early from work, and I was cranking The Who on the family stereo, not in my basement bedroom. And I was embarrassed, and I said, I'm just experimenting, Mom, with rock music. Don't worry. And she was sort of like confused why whoa, what's okay.
This is gateway music, young Brad.
She didn't care, but I felt compelled, to let her know that my studies with jazz and classical will continue unabated, Mother.
That's great.
But I was completely obsessed with that. And then the Tommy soundtrack came out for the movie, and I fell in love with that as well. And then shortly after that, I discovered The Clash, and all hell broke loose.
Joe Strummer.
And AC/DC. Dirty Deeds followed up by Highway to Hell. So, but I was kind of a late bloomer. All of that happened because I got into skateboarding, and I was looking for music to skateboard to, and meeting kids in the neighborhood. At this point, a new neighborhood, and we had built some ramps, and we had a stereo, and we looked for stuff to listen to. We'd listen to anything that rocked that would get your blood going, and so that included Tom Petty, Ted Nugent. I hate to admit it, God.
Zuango the Tango.
Oh yeah. Terrible stuff.
Sorry, I got to reference one of the greatest album titles, though. Intensities in 10
Cities.
Cities.
Yeah, dude, what an idiot that guy. He was dumb right from the get-go. And by 1978, I was starting to go to rock shows. But to answer your question, guitars. I also loved the first Boston album, an amazing sounding record.
Yeah.
And those guitars are just big, big, big. But in my mind, I didn't discriminate between a song by Boston, the right kind of song, or a song by Ted Nugent, or Cheap Trick, or the Buzzcocks, or the Clash. It was or Devo, for that matter. All of it served one purpose at the time, which was it got me excited to skateboard. And I built a half pipe in my backyard, and we did cassette tapes of stuff that would get you psyched to skate. And eventually, the punk rock started to overtake, the classic rock, and eventually it was all new wave and punk rock with healthy doses of Highway to Hell thrown in there, and always Cheap Trick. And what I noticed then was just how loud the guitars were, especially Highway to Hell. I have to say, I think for most of the guitar rock I record for 30 years, I still use Highway to Hell and Back in Black as my gold standard.
Nice.
For panning, for the sound, especially Highway to Hell. The song Highway to Hell specifically, if you listen to the intro guitars, it's a close mic. There's a little bit of probably a plate reverb in there, but there's a lot of room mic as well. And at least to my ears, it sounds like there's room mic. And that's the sound of Marshalls just, screaming away, nice and loud. And I reference all the time to this day. And a lot of my references are from that era. I think we're all susceptible to it when we're children into our early teens. Music matters more to you perhaps then than any other time. And the stuff that really affected me as far as rock music was really guitar heavy stuff. And even though I love synth rock and I'm a jazz guy, my job mostly these days for almost 30 years has been to record loud guitars. And so I returned to the stuff that really stirred me and really inspired me. And having said all that, the guitar stuff, is twinned with really intense vocals. So with, the punk rock stuff, like with Buzzcocks or Dead Kennedys or the Germs, or X, there were really serious messages, and even with Devo, Devo was not a jokey band in my book. They were talking about politics and I mean, de-evolution, the whole idea behind the band, the name of the band.
Oh, right.
That was a pretty heady sort of arty take on society, and cynical as well. Duty Now for the Future is a dark album. There's almost nothing positive in that. I mean, it's a dystopian take on all of society. And so
my daughter would love that record. I'm gonna have to play it for her. She loves dystopian movies. She keeps talking about it now.
It's a grim worldscape, that they paint on that record.
Yeah.
The Day My Baby Gave Me a Surprise is maybe like the sweetest song on there, but even then it's about a mutant.
Wow.
But anyway, loud guitars. I just I spent a lot of time mixing. I did even back then, and I would mix and put stuff on a cassette back then, and eventually on a CD. And nowadays I mix and I bounce it down and put it onto Dropbox, and then it streams from my phone and from my laptop. And I have always used the crappiest playback that is most likely to be used by everybody we know, which nowadays is a laptop or a phone speaker. Mm-hmm. Back in the old days, it was my Renault Car's crappy stereo. I have to hear it on that, and I almost always go back in and revise the mix, and I turn the guitars up by like 3 or 6 dB. Great. Even though this is my job for 30 years, I still find myself underselling the guitars. So I think maybe by the time I'm finally done tweaking and tinkering around, it's finally loud enough. I like loud guitars. I like them coming out of the left speaker. If there's 2 guitar players, this guy's always coming out of the left speaker. This other guy's always coming out of the right speaker, like Angus and Malcolm Young. That's how nature intended it to be.
Yeah.
So I'll hard pan to 100% or 90% the close mic on the guitar, and then I'll put the room mic maybe up the center, or for that guitar panned over on the same side, maybe 10% or 20. It basically carve out space, let them just blare away. And then solos, maybe up the center, or you can do something funny with it, some sort of effect. But that hasn't really changed at all since the 80s for me.
What about the guitar tones? I mean, like when you worked with Veruca Salt, for example, did you get particularly involved in helping to set the right amp tones and that sort of thing? Or do you just kind of let them rock and that's usually what it takes?
I tinker with them. Yeah, I did then, I do now. I don't have a lot of guitar pedals. I have a handful. I'm not really a guitar player. I have some, and I have some amps, but I would prefer the bands to bring in what they like to use, and then we'll go from there. So these days, I don't see a lot of Marshalls, and I see almost no Bogners, or none of the great big amps that we saw in the 90s.
Right.
I see a lot of reissued Fenders, and not so much the Tweeds anymore. Those have kind of fallen out of favor, but I see a lot of Fender products, which is just fine with me. And the general quality of the guitar pedals and guitars and amps that I see these days is way up from where it was in the 90s. It was, back then everyone was broke all the time.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
So to answer your question, I tweak sounds all the time. That's one of my favorite things to do, is to help come up with cool guitar tones. And so even with a band like Touché Amoré, who are playing within a genre which is sort of post-hardcore rock that has some pretty strict guidelines, at least self-imposed by the band themselves and by their audience, we play a lot with tones. They have a ton of pedals, but when it comes time to hit with that really big distorted sound, I've got a handful of sounds and go-tos that I swear by and really haven't altered much.
They'll work.
Oh yeah.
One question though, an observation on my part is sometimes it seems like the guitars that rock more, the gain is not turned up quite as much as you might think it would be. Like sometimes maybe if you turn up the master gain on your amp and the pre-gain a little less and just turn up the level of the guitar, that can rock more than an overly gained guitar. But I guess it's just really song specific and artist specific too.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's part of what our job, can be described as, is to help, be a tone meister. You have the experience of knowing how these things are going to translate, not just immediately coming off tape or off the hard drive, but also as you get further down the road to mixing and then mastering. And that an overcompressed sound or an overly bright sound or an overly bassy sound might sound really kick-ass in the moment, but might not translate by the time you get to the end of the process.
Very cool.
So, you have to learn that by trial and error, or if you're just sort of gifted and you just sort of naturally get it, fine. But returning back to these classic albums that inspired me back in the day is a way to sort of palate cleanse myself and maybe, pull back some gain once you listen to just how hard Back in Black rocks, and yet the distortion is, dialed way down from maybe a more modern new metal record or something.
Yeah. Well, Rockstars, we're going to take a break now, and then we'll come back in for the jam session. I want to remind you that we will have links to all the stuff that Brad is talking about here in the show notes, so you can just click through. If you're on your iPhone or something, you just click right through right there, and we'll include links to the YouTube clips. Check out the music and to Brad's website, and we'll be right back for the jam session. Hey Rockstars, I want to thank our sponsor for this episode, Mic Tech Audio, right here in Nashville, Tennessee. Mic Tech is a maker of awesome microphones and recording equipment. Whether you're looking for a simple plug-and-play USB mic or a high-end condenser tube mic, Mic Tech has you covered. Mic Tech is the only mic I've used for this podcast, recording Studio Rockstars, and nearly 100 episodes. You're hearing my voice right now on the Mic Tech Procast SST. Thanks to you Rockstars for listening, and to Mic Tech Audio for the sound of over 350,000 downloads. Check them out at mictechaudio.com. Cheers. Hey Rockstars, we're back. This is Lid Shaw. We're going to jump into the jam session now. My guest today is Brad Wood. Brad, are you ready to jam?
I'm ready to jam.
Sweet, man. Do you usually jam? I mean, are you doing like a jazz jam, or would you be rocking out jamming? You're a drummer, so. That was an unprepared question. Impromptu.
I jam.
Excellent. That's good enough.
Absolutely.
So now, when you started out in recording, what was holding you back?
Oh, man, fear of failure, fear of being called out for not knowing what I was doing. I was petrified. If you ever get around to interviewing Brian Deck, he can say, yeah, Brad called me like 1,000 times a day, the first session that he actually engineered by himself.
That's great.
Terrified. It kept me frozen for a while, where I literally was not doing anything. And I see it to a certain extent in my kids. I think it's just a byproduct of
life,
of being a thoughtful teenager into early adulthood. But fear is it alternately stops me in my tracks. It is also the thing that has motivated me to build recording studios and to hang a shingle out and call myself a producer. Fear of not getting enough done in the time we have on Earth. But fear is the biggest motivator and the biggest obstacle in my life still to this day. Every time I get on a plane to go work with a band somewhere, especially if I travel to it, I swear as I'm sitting down in the plane that I'm just going to get on my phone and call them and cancel it. I'm sorry, guys, I don't know what I'm doing. And I always think this is the record where people are going to recognize that I really don't know what I'm doing. Like, this is it.
That's great. I feel that way a lot too.
Fear. I don't, and I don't even know if I trust anybody who claims to never feel fear.
Well, so fear can prevent you from taking that step forward. All you need to do is just, you know what FOMO is? Fear of missing out, right?
Yes.
So you just need to increase your FOMO that you're going to miss out on the opportunity slightly more than the fear of doing it.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, because that's really the fear of failing has been overcome, in me at least, by the fear of missing out, the fear of regretting not having done something. So I don't know that I'm a natural risk taker. I think I'm pretty risk averse, but my ego, I'm just, you can send me a bill for the therapy session we're doing here. I think my ego has almost forced me to try stuff, like the fear of looking back and going, I could have done that,
Yeah. Well, the beginning of the Butthole Surfers album. Son, always remember, it's better to regret something you have done than something you haven't done. What was that in Hairway to Steven, I think?
Hairway to Steven. By then I'd stopped listening to the Buttholes, but Cream Corn from the Socket of Earl is a hell of a record.
Right on.
And what a great name, too.
Yes, indeed. All right. Well, so now how about some of the best advice you remember receiving?
I thought about this. I had one friend who said, don't get hung up on the gear. And I think you hear that a lot these days, but man, it's more true now than ever because there's so many boutique manufacturers of really great 500 series modules and plugins and speakers. There's, the stuff that's on offer for you to spend your money on is just off the charts. I don't even know where I would start if I were a young engineer.
Well, you have 5 more questions to figure out the answer to that, though.
All right. But yeah, don't get hung up on the gear. It's really not about the gear. Most of the records that I'm known for from the 90s were made on really pretty sketchy gear. At least somewhere along the line in the chain, there was something that was prosumer at best, amateurish, and yet people like Brian and I were able to just make it work. It really wasn't so much of an issue until I started to make some money, and the whole vintage gear thing started to just take off. You do not need anything with the name Neve on it in order to make a great record. And same thing with API or Sennheiser or Neumann or Telefunken. It's not necessary.
Right, but if you have any of those things, you're welcome to enjoy them.
Oh yeah, sure. And of course, if you feel strongly enough about it, you can send those unused, expensive things to me. I can send me an email.
Put them to use.
Yeah.
All right. Now, how about a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce? Something our rock stars could use this very day on their next session.
That's easy. Record a room mic always. I said that before. I said it earlier, but yes, a room mic is always a good thing to have. You may not use it in the end, but it's better to have an actual real sound of a room than to use an artificial room.
You mean like this?
Just like that.
There you go, rock stars. Real-time effects.
That's awesome.
How about a favorite hardware tool? Something physical that you really enjoy having on sessions. It just makes your session better.
A hot water dispenser.
Okay, you mean like de-evolution is fine, but let's embrace evolution and hot water. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, a Zoshi Rushi CDLFC40 is what I like to use, and that's a instant hot water dispenser, which dispenses boiling water at a fingertip. I use it all the time. Singers become addicted to it. I've bought them for other singers after they've left, and I've had sent them to them. That plus some tea and lemon, that'll help you more than any plugin or any other piece of hardware when you're recording vocals.
Very cool.
I'm totally serious.
I love it, man. This is the best answer yet, and it's going to go in the show notes. Are there any teas we might want to stay away from?
Caffeinated teas in general, dairy products, 100%. Chamomile tea is good. Maybe a green tea if people are getting tired and you need a little bit of caffeine. Honey is really good, and if you can have some sliced lemon, not just lemon sitting there with like a dull knife, but you've actually taken the time to slice the lemon. And then bottles of water where the singer is going to be singing. Just make it easier for people to get done what they need to get done. And singers, more than any other musician in the band, are more dependent on the undefinable things like dry weather or a cold or a late night, unable to sleep. Your voice is so dependent on so many things that are most of the time out of your control. I found that as a record producer, I really have to think hard about our poor singers and what they're facing. It's daunting. How
and when do you discover those things that make the singer sing best? Do you do that long before you hit the studio? Do you ask the singer, hey, when do you like to sing during the day? Or do you find as a producer you often have to do a little bit of discovery process on that?
I ask, when's a good time for you to sing? Almost none of them say early morning. I just don't think that that's a good time for people to sing.
Sometimes my voice is an octave lower if I have a hangover and I haven't eaten cereal for breakfast.
I bet you Leonard Cohen mostly sang in the early mornings. It really depends on the singer, but most of them tend to say later in the afternoon if they've woken up a little bit and some of the phlegm is cleared out. And that's usually true. A lot of it is just also just human nature, warm water. I'm not even kidding. It's a lifesaver, this hot water dispenser. I think that's why so many people drink so much coffee when they're trying to cut vocals, because it's maybe in the studio the only source of something warm. And God, they're like $50 on Amazon. It's so worth it. I've gone through a bunch. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know it sounds silly, but I thought about this question before you asked it, and it's probably, when it comes to cutting vocals, maybe the single most important thing that I've discovered in the last 10 years. Although I discovered hot water and tea, I had an electric kettle back then, but then you have to wait for the thing to boil. What a singer wants right away is something to soothe their sore voice. And almost always there's just more work to do than maybe technically what their voice should put up with. We're making rock records. We're not doing rumors over the course of a year. These days, time is of the essence. And,
indeed.
And it really is helpful. I mean, I've got a bunch of different microphones, and I could say, I never go anywhere without my SM7, but I go all over the place without my SM7, but I do not go anywhere without a hot water dispenser.
All right, good. Great answer. Now, how about a software tool, something that might be a favorite or just something cool that you recently discovered and want to let the rock stars know about?
Well, rock stars, I really like convolution reverbs. There's a lot of them out there. I think Altiverb is still the best. They have so many useful sounds. It's just amazing. That is really kind of almost the only reverb that I use as a plugin. I really like the UAD stuff. I especially like the 1073 channel strip. That's amazing, and it sounds a lot to me like the real thing. And I really like their compressors, the universal compressor, the 1176.
Nice.
Boy, I use that a lot. And the DBX 160 on bass guitar, to me, sounds better than the hardware version I have sitting right here next to me.
Cool.
So there you go.
Probably doesn't have as much, like loss of low end or something like that too.
Yeah, but it sounds like an a DBX 160. I love plugins, and I don't really have I don't have a problem with the idea of abandoning the hardware versions, because it's not like tape machines and compressors grow naturally in the forest and you go out and harvest them. And they're not. There's nothing natural about any of that stuff. They're all created by man. They're all man-made. They all involve electronic components of which you can put contacts on. You can measure the voltages, and you can measure the input versus output, and you can figure it out. I mean, it's all math that made those hardware versions in the first place, and the software versions. To me, it's all kind of one and the same. If it sounds right and it works, then you know what? That's fine.
You know what? Just make music. All right. So how about a resource for the business side of this? If people don't want to just do this for a hobby, do you have any online tools or advice you'd like to share?
That was a tough one, because I don't really utilize any, your listeners might not know, but you provided some sample things for me to look at. And I don't use Google Docs at all. And I don't use any invoicing apps. I just use, I'm an Apple guy. So I stick to Pages to do my invoicing. But what I do really rely on is social media presence. I don't know if that falls under this category.
Yeah, sure.
All right, man. Instagram.
Okay.
I can confidently say that in a given year, depending on the year, 60 to 80% of the work I do comes from Instagram.
Really?
Directly attributed to Instagram likes from a band or an artist who has liked a photograph that has me tagged in it from another artist I'm working with, and then they maybe will start following me, or they'll go to my profile and they'll click to my website, bradwoodmusic.com, and then contact me. And I've got an email that's dedicated just to that website, so I know when it comes just from an inquiry, someone or a visitor to my site. And then I'll ask them, they'll say, hey, do you ever mix a band that's not signed? Like, that's pretty much all I do is mix a band that's not signed. Right. And they send me, they say, well, here's our music on Bandcamp or SoundCloud. And I'll ask, how did you find out about me? And they'll say, oh, we're huge fans of Touché Amoré, and we've been following them in the studio with you on Instagram.
That's great.
Instagram more than Facebook. Facebook, for me at least, is like a closed loop of friends and people I already know. And those resources are important, managers and artists and friends who might be in the industry. But for me, Instagram has proved to be really valuable as far as people being able to find you that are already interested in music because they're maybe following the artist that you're working with or the genre that you're involved with, as long as you're doing the right things on Instagram as far as, tagging posts, using hashtags.
Yeah.
But you must have a website as far as I'm concerned. It's got to be usable, and just blow off everything else and just go to Squarespace and just do it that way. It took me 2 days to do my newest website, which is about 1.5 years old. And
it looks great. I mean, it's simple and straightforward, and I clicked through on music, and you did the smart thing. There's a big grid of YouTube clips, which is what I like to do in the blog post here, because if I'm scrolling through, I just see something, oh, that looks cool, and I'll click it, and it plays right there.
I'm glad you said that, because it was kind of a guess. I've got a couple of friends who are really, experienced with web design. And one of the things that they kept telling me is like, don't overload people with words and a discography. Well, my discography now goes for 30 years and over 500, almost 550 albums. And I could list them all, and maybe they are listed somewhere. I don't know, but I don't know that that's what anybody, my eyes glaze over thinking about it. And when I go to other producers' websites and they have this like complicated page where it says, what role they performed, did they produce, engineer, mix, and there's like a legend sometimes with P equals produced and E equals engineered and CO/P equals co-produced, or M equals mixed, or ME equals mastered. Like it's crazy. And I just, and none of them, and maybe there's like a click through for the band, you click on it and then it takes you to their YouTube page, or it takes you to like their Facebook page or their MySpace page, or, or some other dead link. Well, you know what? I want people watching or listening to the music that I've worked on within my site. I don't want them to leave my site. Yeah. And so that's super important to have. And I have no discography on my website. I'm not interested in that. People who are that interested in what I've done can go to Wikipedia or just, Google search a bit more and find it somewhere else. I want my website to be as simple as possible. What is the name of the person, me, Brad Wood? What is my role? Record producer. Yeah. And then we go from there. So anyway, that's a long answer, but social media keeps the lights on here. I wouldn't exist without it these days.
Well, that's great. And you've already sort of answered the next question, where you don't really mess with Google Docs and things. So organizational online. Maybe, do you have any comments about organizing your hard drives and all the content that is part of your studio, the music?
Oh man. Yeah. Synchronize Pro X. Always back up. Back up. If you work every day or anytime you work, at the end of that day, whether it's just a couple of hours or if it's a marathon 20-hour session, go the extra step to plug in an external hard drive, not an internal hard drive. And you should own Synchronize Pro X or any of the other ones that are incremental backups. But I prefer this one. I've had it for years and years, and do not rely on any Apple backup.
Interesting. What's it? Time Machine. You're saying don't rely on that?
No, not at all.
Have you had a bad experience with that one?
Yeah, I've had it lose its mind more than once. Although I've never used it to back up something as vital as work. Use a third party like Synchronize Pro X and start. This way, you get to start a new backup for each project. Whereas like Time Machine basically just scans your drive and backs up to a designated backup drive, right? Synchronize Pro X, you start a new document for each project you're working on. So that makes it more specific, and you can control the parameters of it. You can turn it on when you want to turn it on. It's like the Apple stuff. The desire is to be more integrated with everything you do, and I like to deploy backups when I feel like it. Yeah. And
I want to be less integrated with Pro everything X. I do. I want that. I want that project off my computer as fast as possible.
But back that thing up every single time you work. And it might seem boring and redundant, and I just don't care. I've burnt myself so many times with that. And in fact, I'll just be really honest. That happened to me January or February, where I had been doing some really crazy long hours, and I don't remember how I did it. I deleted an entire song off of a project. Like, I deleted the whole damn thing. I mean, it must have, I think I was scrolling over something and highlighting some things to be thrown in the trash.
Sure, yeah.
And this guy got caught in that highlighted, section, and I hit, I do a lot of keyboard commands, and so I command delete, then empty
the trash, right?
Yeah, command shift delete, and I do it without even thinking. I almost never look in the trash before I throw stuff out. I've just gotten into the habit of key commands.
Yeah, me too.
And I threw an entire song out.
That's such a bummer.
And I didn't even know that I'd done it till like a couple of days later when the band came in and we were opening up the songs to continue overdubs, and I couldn't find the song for the life of me. And we had music in two different locations, two different drives, and I couldn't find it on the one, and I couldn't find it on the other one. I'm like, be damned. I mean, what the hell? We've been working on this thing since December.
Man,
gone.
What a bummer.
But I had done a backup minutes before I'd thrown it off. I lost nothing.
That's great.
And I restored it, and off we went. That happens once every 10 years with me or something like that. And fortunately, it's not a common experience, but hard drives sometimes fail. And keep that hard drive off-site. So I work in my backyard. I keep my backup hard drives in my house. They're not in the same building, just in case there's a robbery or an earthquake or a fire or something like that. Because that's part of the whole "don't fuck the talent" thing.
Right.
Don't screw over the talent because you're lazy or because it's inconvenient or any other reason. Because this just might be work for you or a session or a means to an end. It might not be inspiring musically, but to the people who've been kind enough, gracious enough to hunt you down and hire you and entrusted you with something, well, this might be the only time they ever get into a recording studio. This may be the culmination of decades of cumulative years of time spent learning their instruments, writing their songs. This may be like them dragging themselves to the finish line for the last time. This may be the most important thing in their lives. And odds are it is. Treat it like that.
Yeah, that's good advice. We were talking about that just earlier today when I was talking with Kyle too. So now last two questions, Brad. These ones are both hypothetical. This one is imagining yourself starting over, or you're seeing your kids go off and, begin a process like this. Maybe they're not going into music, but somebody who's starting over, they need a simple setup to record. They need to meet people to make music with, and they need to make ends meet to survive while they launch a career in recording. What advice would you have?
Well, as far as equipment, a laptop, 2 microphones, a stereo converter of almost any kind, they're super inexpensive, and a pair of headphones, and maybe 1 mic stand, and you're good.
Yeah.
And you have to have the software as well.
But there are so many free versions of software now to start out. I mean, I think
you can start out with Audacity. I mean, I've used that.
Well, I think even Studio One, Pro Tools, not Logic, but GarageBand, those are, and Reaper, they're all free.
Yep. They're all free. And any of those will work. That really, if I were 18 starting now, I would tell me to do that.
That's great. Now, what about finding people to make music with?
It's good to live in a city where there's a lot of music being made. So I left the city I lived in, and I went to a city where there was a lot of music being made. So I would suggest that is probably still the case. So a city like you're in, like Nashville, is great. A city like Los Angeles has gotten much better than it used to be, because even though there are lots of musicians here, the industry for a long time, to me at least, seemed kind of closed and not open to newcomers who didn't put in a lot of hours or time, ingratiating themselves. But that seems to kind of been blown wide open with the internet. But conversely, you could just toil away in complete isolation, like Justin Vernon did, for Bon Iver, and just go do it in your family's winter cottage.
Nice.
But But the advice, if you want to be a record producer, not so much a solo artist like Bon Iver is, I would go to where the musicians are, and it might take a little bit of research. But man, that usually for me works pretty well. I went to where there are a lot of bands, and it was really easy to find clients.
Well, I liked your advice about Instagram too. That seems like that's a pretty easy way to potentially connect with people through the internet if you don't feel like you have as many people locally, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sorry I didn't even think of that because, you know, the internet has basically expanded our backyards, you know, exponentially. So the ability to meet people is a lot, you know, more expanded now. So
well, hopefully it won't make your backyard too big because you still got to carry those backup hard drives to the house every
That's
day.
right.
So, all right. So then last one of that 3-part question, making ends meet. Do you feel like somebody starting out should focus 100% on music and look for income and survival there? Or is it okay to take jobs outside? I mean, you know, it sounds like you were more than happy to take a job outside if it was needed.
Well, that actually, I'll try to keep it quick, but that really is like the crux of my entire record production career. And to a lesser extent, someone like Brian Dex, his story, he can tell his own story. But when we were in college together, we were seeing friends of ours who were older, who might even been better musicians than we were, leaving school. And then we'd run into them. Maybe they'd come back for a visit, or we'd run into them, you know, in Chicago. To a person, it seemed at the time that they were all getting jobs outside of the music industry in order to make ends meet. And to a person, they were all becoming less of a musician and more of, I don't know, assistant manager at America West, working at a record store and then becoming the manager of the record store. And man, I haven't touched the piano in 2 years now. So Brian and I decided that we needed, in order for because we were in a band and we were going to try to make our career work, and I was going to hopefully be a session saxophone player and get my musical feet under me in Chicago. And we decided that we'd get jobs in the music industry, preferably at recording studios, so that we would have a day job that paid the rent, but that would be nominally, at least, in the music business. And working at a record store was like the least music job that I could stomach. Working at a recording studio was like fully in the music industry, but still was initially, for me, it meant to be just a day job. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be my career. I'm a strong believer in doing all you can to sacrifice and cut away all of the unnecessary accessories of life in order to focus on the thing that you've decided you want to do. And when it came to record production, once Brian and I decided to build this recording studio, I quit my job at Chicago Recording Company and, shacked up with my girlfriend, or a succession of girlfriends. I eventually ended up living in the garage. I rented half a garage to park my car and my motorcycle. And I eventually moved into that garage and lived there for 6 months because it was only $65 a month. And I had a cot in a sleeping bag, a motorcycle, and my car.
That's great.
And then the other half of the garage was somebody else, like somebody who rented the other half, and he kept his van there.
And
the job
Rockstars,
as a janitor
in Chicago, garage is important because it's freezing cold there in the winter, and you want to park your car somewhere safe, right?
Yeah, it was nice. It was a luxury that I had, that I allowed myself, but to have a garage. But I had a really nice motorcycle and a really nice car, and this place was cheap. So my point being that, do whatever you need to do, but just don't pick a job that's going to develop into a real thing. I loved my job as a janitor at Chicago Theater, and I appreciate them hiring me and letting me work, but it was a midnight to 8 a.m. shift. There was no career advancement in janitorial services that I was aware of. It was a dead-end job. It was meant to be a dead-end job, and everybody that had the job, my coworkers, it wasn't what they wanted to do in 20 years. But it allowed me daytime and enough money, to not starve to death. Just have a keen eye on not getting sucked into life's little cul-de-sacs, especially when it comes to your employment. They become really important, and you might, that demands a lot of your attention and is very needy. That's really common, where you end up, expending so much mental energy, not just on the job, but after, especially now with smartphones and email. You're constantly getting texts from your employers or from your coworkers. You're being asked to do, like all of us, extra work outside of your workday. Be careful of that. Be really mindful. I would rather take a job cleaning toilets that's completely mindless, and I check in, I punch out at the end of the shift, and I don't think again about it.
Yeah.
Than to have a job that's like, second guessing, I got my degree in accounting, so I'm doing the books for whatever, anything at all, really, that takes up that takes up too much time, that gets too close to the time that's going to be really required to do this job correctly. Half measures when it comes to engineering and spending time in the studio almost never cut it.
Yeah.
I mean, this job will require you to spend an inordinate amount of time doing it. It's really time intensive. It always has been for me. It's never really diminished that much. The tools of the trade have changed dramatically. It doesn't seem to have diminished the amount of time I spend. It's about the same, which is a lot. And I'm sure you can attest to that. Like, it will take all the time that you can afford it and then some.
Yeah, but at least now you're spending all that time a yard's distance away from your family and children.
Oh, yeah, it's great. I'm not complaining about that. I'm just, if I had to give advice to my younger self.
There it comes. You just beat me to the punch, so go for it.
All right. Two things. I would applaud myself for not getting a job that took me away from music. And I would say, pay attention to lyrics more. Don't obsess on the sound of the guitars, the sound of the drums as much as I did at the time. I would say, look for those singers who are really saying something important to you, at least, and really dote on them. That's something that came to me late in my career, relatively speaking.
That's great. I think of it as being early, but I guess you had already been making a lot of records by that point.
Hundreds by then.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Well, Brad, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. This is like bucket list material for me personally, so I really appreciate you taking out what is quite a chunk of time to chat with us. We didn't really get to talk about it, but maybe I'll include a couple of links in the show notes as well. I know you've begun teaching too, and you have some courses out there. So if there's anything you'd like me to share with the Rockstars, I'd be happy to make sure they know all about it.
Yeah, I've just done the one Produce Like a Pro, like Pro Mix Academy with Warren Huart, who's got a really cool thing going, and he was kind enough to ask me to mix a song and film it, afterwards and tell everybody about what it was that I did, and that was really fun. And I would do more of it. We're trying to get our schedules together to focus on some things. I don't really think there's any reason not to share as much as I know with anybody else. If it can hasten the time at which young engineers can get better at what they're doing, if there's anything at all that I can help to do that, great. Because nobody likes to hear badly engineered acoustical instruments.
And music that doesn't rock, it just doesn't rock.
That's right.
Records that don't rock don't rock.
And the people that are listening, your rock stars, are by definition wanting to rock. So I'm here to help them bring the rock, and I appreciate you inviting me to take part in this. It's been really cool.
Well, my pleasure. And Rockstars, again, I'll include links to all that stuff in the show notes. It'll either be on your phone or just click through and it'll take you to the full blog post, and you can read about it and click through from there. Brad, thank you again. Tell our listeners how they can find you and learn more about you.
My website is bradwoodmusic.com. I am Bradwood_producer on Instagram, Bradwood3 on Twitter, and Facebook. I've got a producer page. I think it's just Bradwood Producer on Facebook, and also I'm just on Facebook. You can send me a friend request, but I might not unless you send me a message.
So just hashtag you on Instagram.
There you go. Yeah, but I kind of live on Instagram. Facebook is not as useful to me, but Instagram's pretty kick-ass.
And what was the Instagram handle?
Bradwood Producer.
Producer, PRO.
Yep. Yeah, it's like Lucifer with a pro in front. The Bengals gave me that nickname.
Oh, nice, man.
Yeah, I like that one.
Dig it. Well, again, thanks so much, dude. I look forward to meeting you in person someday, and I'm going to go listen to more of your records.
Well, thanks so much, and take care.
All right, cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.